It's great to be here. I am a big fan of the Children's Museum from way back, as Michael said. It's also great to be here with some friends and people I've known for a long time. I did want to ask you, how many of you are parents? Pretty much everybody. How many of you have kids under 10 years old? Okay. So I'm going to focus probably more on young kids today. Let me just ask, I see there are a few dads, there are at least some dads here, and Michael and I have been involved in this dad work for a long time, and I've been tracking sort of dad involvement at these events. And I just want to tell you one quick story, which is I was, at public restrooms now, they have, like airports, they have baby stations in men's restrooms. And this is a new thing over the last 15 years or so. Can everybody hear me?
Not all that well. So
okay. But I have never seen a father actually use one of these baby stations in a men's restroom. So last week I was at the airport and I walked into the men's room and I actually saw a guy at the baby station and I got so excited and I went up and I looked over, I peered over his shoulder, looked at the baby and had his laptop computer out of it. So I thought maybe he was like changing the diaper virtually or something. Anyway, I want to talk about three things today. I want to try and lift kids out of a mud of what I think are misconceptions about how they become good and caring and community-minded and justice-minded people. I want to talk about the real threats to kids' moral development. And I have concerns about peers and the media and TV, but I think the biggest threats to kids' moral development are our intense focus on kids' happiness and achievement. And so I'm going to talk to you about our research about that, and I want to talk about solutions, about what we can do as parents, what we can do as schools a little bit, and maybe even Michael and I discuss what even the Children's Museum might do around kids' moral development in this city. And let me just start with the misconceptions, because I fuss about this because there is a billion-dollar character education industry out there which is about teaching kids values. And if you ask, there's a public agenda survey that says that 70% of Americans think the biggest problem with kids today is that they don't know fundamental values, they don't know right from wrong. We spend a lot of time repeating and chanting and extolling these values with kids from very young ages. And I became concerned about this about 8 or 9 years ago when my daughter was around 6 years old, and I was talking to her and a couple of her friends, and I asked them a question on a popular character education program. And the question is, should you be honest with your teacher if you forget your homework? And one of my daughter's friends said to me, do you want me to tell you what you want to hear, or do you want me to tell you the truth? And another one of her friends said, I know you want me to say I should be honest, but no kid would be honest about that. I think the problem with all this repeating and chanting about values is that kids, the research shows, basically know the values by the time they're 5 or 6 years old. They know that stealing is wrong. They know that honesty and caring and fairness are important, or at least important to adults. And because they know these values, especially as they become teenagers, I think they feel patronized by these lectures about value, and I think what we are teaching them is how to parrot back what we want to hear. I am obviously for these values, but I don't think the issue is moral literacy. I don't think it's the first one on the list. I don't think the primary issue is that kids know right from wrong or know the values. I think the issue is moral identity. How do these values become a deep part of the self? How do these values become a part of a child's identity? How do you develop an internal commitment to these values so they're more important than your happiness or your achievement at any given moment? And I think there are a couple parts to this. One is, how do you help children want to be good people in the world? How do you inspire and motivate children to be good? And the other is, how do you create in kids a moral disposition or a reflex? For the Dutch who rescued the Jews in World War II, they don't describe it as a choice. They describe it as something that was as natural to them as breathing. And how from early ages do you create in kids these reflexes, these natural dispositions to care and to be concerned about their communities and to give to their communities, to pitch in many different ways? So as I talk, I'm going to be talking primarily about how do we develop this moral identity in kids. I want to focus on a couple of other moral capacities that I think is very important. One is moral awareness, or circle of concern. So we talk a lot about empathy these days, as if kids have a certain amount of empathy. But when you think about empathy, just about everybody has empathy for somebody. The question is, who do they have empathy for? If you're white, do you have empathy for people of color? If you're rich, do you have empathy for people who are low income? If you're boys, you may have empathy for other boys, but no empathy for girls. You know, when I think about Harvard students, I think about most Harvard students as being very nice. But some of them, you know, don't really consider the custodian or the person serving them dinner at night. They're not part of their circle of concern. And so the issue is, how do you expand kids' circle of concern? How do you make the school secretary, the waitress, the bus driver, people that are not invisible but very visible to our kids? And how do you help them understand how these different people contribute to the world? The third moral capacity I want to talk about is managing destructive feelings. And emotional development and moral development are very interwoven. And again, when you think about times that you have transgressed, my guess is it's not because you didn't know what was right from wrong. My guess it's because you were driven by an emotion: envy, shame, anger, inferiority, lust, the fear of isolation. These are the emotions that drive kids. These are the emotions that drive adults. I still play men's basketball in sort of a laboratory for understanding moral regression. And we know right from wrong, but we can find ourselves acting like baboons sometimes on the court. And I think this is the issue. It is these feelings that we have a hard time managing. And I want to just mention two feelings that I think of as especially important to cultivate in kids, two moral emotions. One is gratitude. And I am elevating gratitude, I'm lifting up gratitude because I think gratitude is so important to kids' well-being, but I also think it's a moral emotion, that when you really appreciate what you have, it's so foundational to appreciating what other people don't have. So I think the work of cultivating gratitude is very important for us. The other emotion that I want to lift up for you is shame. So there's a lot of research about shame being at the root of delinquency, cheating, stealing, violence. James Gilligan has written a wonderful book about shame and how shame is at the root of so many different types of violence. And let me just ask you, does anybody know the difference between shame and guilt? Anyone want to venture a guess? Go for it.
Internal versus external?
Yeah, so that's one big difference. Anything else come to mind? So, were you going to go for it? So guilt is usually about a deed. It's when you violate one of your inner standards. And one of the things about guilt is it almost always insists on and reveals a path to heal itself. So when you feel guilty, you know usually you can apologize or in some way make amends. There is a path that's revealed to repair this feeling of guilt. Shame is about the exposure of defects in the self, and particularly the external, the public exposure of defects in the self. And one difference between shame and guilt is it's so hard to relieve shame. Shame collects in the self. Shame festers in the self. And if I were to ask you to remember your painful memories from childhood, which I will not do, my guess is that you would remember, your memories would be those of shame, times when you felt humiliation, because shame sticks in the self, because shame collects in the self. So I worry about shame, and I worry about two things. I worry about shamelessness. You know, shame and guilt are what bind us as a society. You know, shame and guilt are cornerstones of our consciences. We don't want kids to not feel shame ever. When we punish a kid appropriately, they may feel some shame, and that's okay. And I worry that some parents won't punish their kids because they're worried about their kids feeling shame. But I'm not worried about kids feeling some shame. But I am worried about too much shame and immoderate shame. And there's evidence that, you know, at least in many communities, there is not the overt shaming of kids that people used to do. You know, there's not the you're not as smart as a kid down the block or as nice as a kid down the block or whatever. There's not that kind of explicit shaming, but there are all kinds of implicit ways that we can shame our kids. You know, if we can't deal with their defects, if we're too quick to get them, if we deny those defects exist, or their problems or vulnerabilities exist, or if we're too quick to get them to therapists, we can make them feel like we can't deal with things they're really struggling with and vulnerable about. I'm also concerned that if we elevate too few metrics of success, and I feel like I'm in many communities where the metrics of success in childhood are that you achieve a lot and that you're happy. And some kids aren't going to achieve a lot, and some kids aren't going to be happy. And I worry about kids feeling shame because they're not achieving these two metrics of success, when in fact, as we all know, you know, there are many metrics of what makes a wonderful life and a gratifying life. That we should be valuing kids because they're soulful and funny and kind and good listeners and many other qualities. That we really need to think about how we elevate many metrics of success. These are all things I'm hoping we'll have a chance to talk about. And by the way, we will have plenty of time for discussion. I know I'm talking about a lot of things here. Let me just mention a couple other moral capacities really quickly, and then I want to talk about our research. So how many of you have heard of Lawrence Kohlberg? Great. Carol Gilligan? Great. So one of the things that Kohlberg and Gilligan were up to is that they were also concerned about this heavy emphasis on teaching kids values. And the reason is that when you think about your moral dilemmas or your moral questions, there are probably almost always times when values conflict. So when you ask high school kids, which I've done, you know, what are your moral dilemmas? One dilemma I would hear about a lot is a friend of mine stole a calculator or an iPod or whatever it was. And my teacher asked me who stole the calculator. Should I be loyal to my friend or honest with the teacher? So here is an honesty-loyalty dilemma. You probably had situations where you've had multiple loyalties. The issue isn't you didn't know the value of loyalty. The issue is that you had multiple conflicting loyalties to people. We had a famous case in Boston, you know, which you all know, the case of William and Whitey Bulger. You know, William Bulger was the president of UMass and a state senator. And there was a survey at the time that said, you know, that asked Bostonians whether William Bulger should collaborate with the police in finding Whitey. And about half of Bostonians said no, he's his brother. And another half of Bostonians said, you know, it's a loyalty issue. You got to be loyal to your brother. And another half of Bostonians really saw it as a justice issue. You know, is of course you have to. Billy should be collaborating with Whitey. This guy is a murderer. So here again, here is loyalty and justice in conflict. And what Kohlberg and Gilligan were saying is that we have to be able to develop kids' moral reasoning, their capacity to reason through these kind of moral conflicts. And this is a complicated issue. I just want to say two things about it quickly, and it's, again, something we can discuss. But, you know, one way in which they were saying that you really need to, and they had different views about this, but one way is by taking multiple perspectives. So as a kid, you need to take the perspective of the kid who was stolen from. You need to take the perspective of other kids who might be stolen from, the teacher, et cetera. And you also need to think about what principles underlie a just community. So how can I act in a given time that supports the principles that underlie a just community, or how might I act in a way that could be undermining to those principles that underlie a just community? The last two are the social emotional skills needed for moral functioning. This is just the skills you need to treat people well day to day. How do you help somebody else without patronizing them? How do you praise appropriately? How do you criticize appropriately? Some kids do those things very naturally, and some kids don't do those things naturally. And the final one I'm going to talk about in a minute, which is the strength and maturity of the self. But this is the core of courage. It's the core of being able to stand up for important principles. Okay, let me tell you about our research. So we did research in 5 high schools. One of those high schools was an independent school outside of Boston with a very high percentage of affluent kids. One was a high school in Boston with a very high percentage of low-income kids. Another was Cambridge Ringen Latin High School, where my kids went, which is an extraordinarily diverse school where something like 110 different countries are represented, and diverse on income as well, and 2 schools in the South. One in a working class neighborhood of Atlanta, and one in a working class and low income rural area of Tennessee. And we asked many different questions about kids' ideals, about race and class and culture differences, but I wanted to dig into one aspect of this research that I found especially revealing. We asked kids, what's most important to you? Being a happy person, being a good person who cares about others, achieving at a high level, or having a high status career. We also asked them to imagine what's most important to your parents. Like, how would your parents rank those things for you? Achievement, happiness, goodness, having a high status career. You know, people mean very different things by happiness. They mean different things by goodness. So how do you define happiness? How do you define goodness? How do you define high achievement? And what do you see as the relationship between these things, between happiness, goodness, achievement, etc.? Almost 2/3 of kids said that their happiness was more important than their goodness, and about 2/3 of kids said it was more important to their parents that they were happy than that they were good. And I want you to pause and just think about that for a minute, because the child historians tell me that the degree to which we have promoted happiness as the goal of child raising and demoted morality or goodness as a goal of child raising is probably unprecedented in our history. So this is something I think we need to be concerned about. I also want to be clear that just about every kid we talked to, every parent we talked to cared about goodness. It wasn't as if they didn't care about goodness. And in many ways, what was interesting was how they resolved these tensions between happiness and goodness. Because what a lot of kids said, a lot of parents said, is that if I'm happy, and particularly if I have high self-esteem, if I feel good about myself, then I will have more to give to others. So it's sort of like the oxygen mask on the airplane. I have to fill myself up first, and then I will have more to give to other people. And it dovetails with the self-esteem movement, which has been telling people for decades now, for a few decades, that if you feel good about yourself, if you have high self-esteem, you will be more virtuous. You will have more to give to others. You will be more caring. And again, I want you to pause and consider how unusual this is. You know, the Bible and Western literature have been telling us for centuries, not that happiness was the source of morality, but that suffering was the source of morality. That taking on burdens, sacrificing, empathy for those who were suffering were the foundation for morality. That many parents are telling their kids that self-esteem or happiness are the foundation for morality, I think is, in this country, I think is unprecedented in the history of humankind. And I don't think this is a silly idea. You know, I think that positive feelings can make you more expansive, more generous. Self-esteem can help you stand up for yourself, can help you stand up for important principles. But I don't think of happiness or self-esteem as the foundation for morality. I think of these things as the foundation for morality: a moral identity, moral awareness, being able to manage destructive feelings. And I also think all sorts of positive moods can make you dangerously arrogant and oblivious. You know, contentment can breed entitlement and indifference. Sports fans don't riot when their team loses the championship game. Sports fans riot when their team wins the championship game. What the research shows is that bullies, delinquents, narcissists often have not low self-esteem, but high self-esteem. High school athletes who abuse their girlfriends can have high self-esteem. They can feel very powerful. So self-esteem doesn't mean you're going to be moral, or it doesn't protect you from being immoral. And the irony is that I think all this attention on making kids happier isn't even making them happier. You know, I think the legendary lengths that we're going to spare kids disappointments and failure, or many of us are going to spare kids disappointments or failures or losses. You know, the maneuvering to get kids on winning sports teams or to make sure kids don't experience adversity of any kind, the allergy to adversity. I mean, these things can deprive kids of exactly the coping capacities that are really needed for long-term well-being. The attention to kids' moment-to-moment feelings. You know, I am sometimes on playgrounds in Cambridge, and I'm sure I was guilty of this when my kids were young, where I see some parents noting their kids' feelings every 10 minutes. That must make you sad, that must make you angry, that must make you frustrated. You know, it's like the mood police are out. And And you know, it's like pulling up a bandage every 10 minutes to see if a wound is healing. You know, it is very important to get kids to identify and articulate their feelings. It's especially important to get boys to identify and articulate their feelings. But the frequency with which we're doing this, you know, I worry that it makes kids hyper-attentive to their own feelings. It makes them dramatize their own feelings. It makes them engage with their own inner theaters. We would do just as well or better to spend as much as time tuning kids in, not to their own feelings, but to other kids' feelings on the playground. So I'm not against this. I think we should be doing some of it, but we could also be doing more of tuning kids into other kids' feelings. And you know, the good research seems to show that by and large we have this backwards. It's not self-esteem or happiness that leads to caring for others or goodness. It's the capacity to tune into other people and care for other people that leads to self-esteem and happiness. And that's because when we can really tune in and care for other people, we're going to have more gratifying relationships for our whole lives. We're going to have better marriages. We're going to be better parents. We're going to be better friends. We're going to be better grandparents and mentors. And those gratifying relationships are the most robust, durable source of self-esteem and well-being that we have. So in saying this, I'm worried about feeding another myth, and I just want to be clear about this. And that's the idea that we should tell kids to be good because it will make them happy. And I found when my kids were young, I would sometimes do this, that I would say, be nice to other kids because then they'll be nice to you. Or pass the ball, I used to coach basketball, pass the ball because then other kids will pass the ball back to you. And I think, you know, as I said, I think certain forms of goodness can lead to happiness or well-being, but I don't think we should tell kids to be good because it will make them happy. And I have two concerns about this. One is certain forms of morality, certain forms of goodness don't make you happy. You know, standing up for important principles, standing up for a friend can cause you to be ostracized. Caring for somebody who's chronically sick can be really tough, but we should tell kids often to do those things anyway. And the second thing I'm concerned about is that I worry that we've lost our sense of morality for its own sake, that we should be telling kids to do good because it's good. We should tell kids to be moral because it's moral. We should tell kids to do what's right because it's right and important for our collective good. Let me just focus on a few more concrete ways in which I think we can shift this balance away from happiness and more toward concern or caring for others. And one of them is, you know, pretty straightforward. You know, we have this reflex to tell our kids the most important thing is that you're happy. And what about if instead we said to them the most important thing is that you're kind, or the most important thing is that you're kind and that you're happy? The novelist Henry James said that three things in human life are important. The first is to be kind, the second is to be kind, and the third is to be kind. The second is that I think we could be much more aware of the subtle ways that we prioritize our kids' happiness over their concern or well-being for others. And, you know, I know that when my kids were young, I sometimes didn't require them to reach out to a friendless kid on the playground or to return phone calls from friends, or they'd write off kids who were annoying, and I just sort of let them do that. And all these ways, I think we prioritize our kids' happiness over their caring for other people. I was interviewing a couple who was talking about their daughter, who was 16 years old at the time, about whether she should quit the soccer team. And the mother said, let her quit. She's not having any fun anymore. And the father said, we can't let her quit. She's a really good soccer player, and it's going to be important for her getting into college. And I remember thinking to myself that neither one of them expressed any concern about her obligation to the team. And I was talking to my wife about a year later, and we were talking about my daughter who was thinking about leaving a dance group that she was in. And I said, you know, let her quit. She's not having any fun anymore. And my wife said, excuse me, Mr. Moral Development. You know, we can't just let her quit this group. You know, she has an obligation to this group. And I worry that we no longer tell kids that have an obligations to their teams, to their groups, to their schools as communities, to their classrooms as communities, to their neighborhoods as communities, and that this is another subtle way in which we prioritize their happiness over their morality. let me just suggest to you finally that rather than making happiness the focus, what if we made maturity the focus? And if you think about maturity as this ability to balance and coordinate our needs with others, to take a third-person perspective, to take a helicopter view of our relationships and sort of look down at them and understand what's going on inside them, to be reflective and self-critical, to receive feedback and to actually change based on that feedback, to manage these destructive feelings I've been talking about. I think these are the qualities that are the basis for productivity at work. I think these are the basis that are these are the qualities that are the basis of strong relationships and therefore of well-being. And I think these are qualities that are at least one important foundation for morality. So I want to talk about a couple of practices that I think are very embedded, that are very entwined with this focus on self-esteem. And I think these will be familiar to you. But one of them is praise. And I think there's an epidemic of praising going on out there, a blizzard of praising. And I'm concerned about excessive global praise, about too much telling kids they're special and terrific all the time. But I want to clarify, I think there is good or bad praise. And good and bad praise. And I started thinking about this several years ago, and I was at the playground, and I was watching a father play catch with his son. And every time this kid threw the ball and caught the ball, the father complimented it. And when the kid dropped the ball, the father said, "Nice try." So there was not a single act that didn't get a compliment of one kind or another. And there are sports programs, character education sports programs, that are telling parents to praise their kids 5 times after every game for every one time they criticize them, and to tell their kids they're proud of them before every game. And I tried this with my own son when he was about 15 years old. Before he had a basketball game, I just said, "Yeah, I just want you to know I'm really proud of you." And he said to me, "What's the matter with you, Dad?" And, he knows when he's really accomplished something or when he hasn't accomplished something. And I think when we praise kids, when they haven't accomplished something, they can find it patronizing. They can ask themselves, why is it you feel this need to prop me up? Carol Dweck has done wonderful research on praise. Carol Dweck is at Stanford. And, she also says that when you're praising kids, you're judging kids too. So in this game between the father and son, this isn't a relaxed game of catch. This is a constant form of assessment. It may be positive assessment, but everything this kid does gets assessed. And Carol Dweck's point is that when we're assessing kids constantly in these ways, they can start to feel more fragile, more vulnerable about performance, more competitive with other kids, more prone to tear other kids down. And finally, I just want to say that I think that it's based on a false notion. This notion of praise is based on a false notion of how the self grows. That we kind of think of the self as like a tank. And the more we praise it, the more we are going to fill up the tank. But I don't think the self grows by being praised. I think it grows by being known. I think it grows when we really have the time to spend with kids to know who they are, to distill who they are, and to reflect back to them who they are, to really appreciate in a deep sense who they are. That's how I think the self grows and matures. So I certainly think we should occasionally praise our kids. We should occasionally tell them they're great and wonderful and special, but out of some accumulated sense that they are great and special and wonderful. I also think Carol Dweck is right that praise should be specific. That it's much more helpful to kids if they do a painting, if you don't say that's a wonderful painting, but you praise something specific about the painting. That's what really encourages effort. Or you praise something about the follow through on the throw in the game of catch. You don't praise everything that this kid does in the game of catch. I think we have to be child and context specific, that there are some kids who soak up praise, who need to learn to deal with less praise. I have a kid who doesn't like to be praised at all, and I think he needs to be able to take some praise. There are some very young kids who have a lot of trouble with self-regulation, who need a lot of external reinforcement and praise. So I don't want to be categorical or generic about this. Finally, I just think we have to ask ourselves, why are we praising kids so much? And why at this time in our history are we praising kids so much? You know, I realize sometimes when I'm really busy, when I'm away a lot from work, I'm away a lot in the evening, I start coming home and telling my daughter how wonderful she is. And it's like, I think that this praise can somehow substitute for my time. And, you know, praise doesn't substitute for time in this way. I think sometimes when I praise other people praise, it can be a way of praising myself or reassuring myself that my kids are doing fine. So I think it's really important to disentangle why we're praising our kids. Is it about our kids or is it about us? I want to clarify that I'm talking here about trends and not about individuals. That, you know, for some kids, I am much less worried about them being too selfish or self-involved. I'm more worried about them being too empathic. I worry especially about some girls who are too empathic or too organized around other people. And I think the challenge for some girls isn't to be more empathic, it's to become more self-assertive and more articulate, more forceful. So I am talking about individuals, not trends. There are also big race, class, and culture differences in what I'm talking about. In low-income communities, in immigrant communities, many African-American communities, you don't see this constant praising of kids. You do see more of a sense of collective responsibility or a sense that kids should attach themselves to communities that are larger than themselves. You do see more day-to-day pitching in and contributing. I want to tell you one sobering fact about immigrant kids. When immigrant kids first get here, across almost every immigrant group, they are doing as good or better than their non-immigrant American counterparts on just about every emotional and moral measure we know. They're less likely to be delinquent, to abuse drugs, to have behavior problems. The longer they're here, the worse they do, and by the third generation, they're doing as bad or worse on all these measures. And we have this idea out there, there's an idea out there in the airwaves that immigrant families are a threat to America's moral culture. What the data seem to suggest is America's moral culture is a threat to immigrant kids and families. And I think this is because a lot of these kids are coming from cultures where there is more collective responsibility, there is more caretaking and pitching in, and they're colliding with American individualism. And they both lose that sense of collective responsibility, and it creates fractures with their parents, who have very different moral ideologies than America's moral ideologies. I want to talk about one more trend that I think will be familiar to you, and then I may take a break and just take any questions you have. I would like to talk a little bit about achievement pressure, even though I know your kids are young. But the trend that I want to talk about is another modern phenomenon, in fact, a giant social experiment, which is our desire to be very close to our kids, and very close to our kids in a certain way, which I think is very tied to the focus on our kids' happiness and self-esteem. And I want to clarify, I think this is a wonderful trend, that I think it's a wonderful thing that we want to be closer to our kids. But I have concerns about it. And I was on an airplane several years ago having a conversation with a guy next door, a stranger, a guy who was in the seat next to me who I didn't know, a father. And I was having the kind of conversation with him that I find that I have with fathers frequently. And it's, you know, I love my father very much. I had a close relationship with my father, but I'm closer to my kids. I spend much more relaxed time with my kids. I share more of my own life with my kids. I think they share more of their lives with me. And he said to me, you know, I know exactly what you're talking about. When I'm with my kids' friends, it's like we're all the same. We get stoned together. And I'm like, that's not exactly what I meant by it. This is going to be a long flight. But I think this is where we're getting into trouble. It's like, how do you be really close to your kids without being their best friends? You know, I don't think the goal here is to be your kids' best friends. I do think that you can be close to your kids in many ways without that being, you know, they're equals in the sense, or the same in the way that he meant it. And I'm fussing about this because I'm underlining it because I think that, you know, for a number of reasons, that kind of closeness is damaging. You know, kids need to idealize us, especially at certain stages of childhood. It's very important that they put us on a pedestal for a period of time. And it's one way in which they internalize our values is by idealizing us. And I worry that if we treat kids as our best friends, that we can compromise this process of idealization. We also have to hold our kids to high ethical standards, and we have to discipline them. And if we do, our kids are going to get angry at us sometimes. And you know, one of the biggest, you know, Michael, other people who work with families, one of the biggest things I hear about from parents today is troubles dealing with their kids' anger. You know, their kids get angry at them, and it's just really hard for them. And I think one of the reasons it's hard for them is because they do become emotionally dependent on their kids in certain ways, for certain kinds of closeness. And finally, you know, kids need to separate from us. And you know, I heard a psychologist on the radio the other day talking about kids having parents having letting go disorder, you know, like having trouble letting their kids go in adolescence. And I know I struggle with this with one of my own kids, with letting him go in adolescence, but from early ages, and letting him separate and individuate. But our ability to appreciate our kids as separate and as different from us is so important for their ability to appreciate other people as separate and different from them. So I think this appreciation of their difference and this enabling them to separate is so important for their moral development. So I just want to say a couple of things about this. One is, like, the bottom line is I think we have to be parents and not friends when push comes to shove. I think it's really important that we consult people we're close to if we feel like our needs for closeness are getting confused or entangled with what's best for our kids. And this certainly happened to me. You know, how much about this closeness is about me and how much is it about what benefits my kids? And I really needed to talk to my wife about that and to close friends about that. But I think this is like something that's hard to think about. I mean, it's hard to self-observe about totally, and that we need other people to help us reflect about that. And the final thing I will say about it is, you know, the way the trend is going, adults are having fewer and fewer friends. Parents are having fewer and fewer friends. They're spending more time watching TV on the internet and more time with their kids. But I worry because they're spending less time with friends that they're depending more on their kids for this kind of friendship or this particular kind of closeness. And I think it's very important to maintain your friendships when you become a parent, or at least maintain some core friendships when you become a parent. When I said at the beginning that I thought there were two big threats to kids' morality, one of them was this focus on self-esteem and happiness, and the other, in some communities, particularly middle and upper class communities, this focus on high achievement and getting into selective colleges. And if you look at the research, and this is Sunaya Luthar's research in Columbia, there are two groups of kids that are really high risk in this country in terms of delinquency, substance abuse, behavior problems, depression, anxiety, low-income kids and high-income kids. So the rates of these problems in low-income communities and high-income communities are very similar. Rates of depression among affluent girls are 2 to 3 times higher than in the general population. And Sunaya Luthar is saying both that we should be concerned about affluent kids. I mean, the causes are different in affluent communities and the consequences are different than they are in low-income communities, but very high rates. And that achievement pressure is a big cause of these problems. Achievement pressure around selective colleges is a big cause of these problems. You know, it's a puzzle with many pieces, but this is a big piece. And as I said, you know, nearly half of the kids in our affluent schools said their parents thought getting into a selective college was more important, or achieving at a high level was more important than being a good person. And in their efforts to promote achievement, I think some parents in affluent communities are doing outright reckless and unethical things. And I know most of your kids are younger, but you're going to be in this world very soon. And I'm talking about things like getting your kids falsely diagnosed as having ADD, so they'll have more time on the SAT, threatening to sue guidance counselors who won't write good recommendations for your kids. There is a community service Olympics going on out there for who can get the most high-profile community service opportunity in many suburban schools and independent schools. I interviewed parents who said to me that they had started for their kid a school in Africa so she could say for community service that she had started a school in Africa, which set off a mini competition, and another parent bought their kid an AIDS clinic in Guam so he could say that it's for their community service. And when I asked, when I talked to kids about this at this independent school, they would say things to me like, you know, you can't just go volunteer in a homeless shelter. You have to cure AIDS for your community service project. So I think there's been a kind of perversion of community service that has gone on. But I'm really less worried about this small fraction of parents than I am about a certain culture. And I'm worried about something much more pervasive and subtle, and that's all the contradictory and hypocritical messages that we can send to kids about achievement. And to use your example, that the kids we talk to would notice when their parents would say, it doesn't matter to me where you go to college. High achievement, in this sense, really doesn't matter to me. And then would pay, jaw-dropping amounts of money for an SAT tutor beginning in the 7th or 8th grade. Other kids would receive messages from parents that seemed designed to take the pressure off, but couldn't possibly take the pressure off. I talked to one mom who said without a trace of irony that it was while it was very important to her that her children go to great colleges, her husband felt differently. He would be happy if they ended up at Swarthmore. Other kids were aware of another kind of hypocrisy. As parents, their parents would say to them, I want you to go to a selective college because it will give you options. It will help you be a doctor or a corporate leader or a lawyer. And I found myself saying this to my own kids, that you want to go to a great schools will give you more options. And the kids that we talked to said things to us like, when they're in these kind of pressure cookers and these very high pressure environments in high school or middle school or in college, in many ways they don't feel like they're being given more options. They feel like they're being given less options, that they don't have the option to be a carpenter or to go into forestry or to be a teacher or to go into firefighting. That, in a way, we're not expanding their options in these cultures, we're narrowing their options. And hearing these stories, I got worried about it, and I decided to talk to my own son, who was probably end of junior year, he was probably 17 at the time, 16 or 17. And we were beginning, we were beginning this pipeline, this madness that begins around getting your kids into college, which I don't wish on you guys. But I said to him, I just want to be really clear. I want you to go to a college that works for you, and I don't really want status to be a big concern here. And he said it pretty nicely, but he basically said, Dad, that is the biggest crock of crap that I have ever heard. And he said, you teach at Harvard. My cousins have all gone to high-status colleges. In this community, it's really important that you go to a high-status college. He's sort of saying to me, you can take the high road here because there are so many pressures, so many forces doing the work for you. It's so in the water. And I was a little ticked off for a minute, but then I realized, he was right. And it really got me thinking about this and thinking about this in a different way and thinking about the conflicting messages that we send to our kids about this. So I want to just offer you a few sort of thoughts or recommendations about this. One is that I think there are many different stances on high achievement that are valid, but I think there are certain forms of achievement pressure that are really out of control and reckless, and we really have to be concerned about. It should be a red flag when a parent's self-esteem plummets because their kid doesn't get into a selective high school or into a selective college. It should be a red flag when conversations with kids are consumed by achievement talk, when you're popping vocabulary cards at the dinner table every night. It should certainly be a red flag when your kids show signs of debilitating stress, that when they're not eating well or they're not sleeping well because they're so focused on achievement. Wendy Mogul, who wrote The Blessing of Skin Knees, said we should adhere to the 20-minute rule. Don't spend more than 20 minutes a day thinking about your kid's achievement. That may seem like a high bar, but it seems like a good bar if your kid isn't having a really difficult academic problem. And, and your comment also suggested this. I talked to Charlie Ducey several years ago, who was the head of the Bureau of Study Council at Harvard. And something like 30% of Harvard students are on medication for anxiety or depression at some point in their Harvard careers. And he said to me, a lot of the time it's about achievement pressure. And he said it might sound trite, but a lot of the work with these students when they come in for counseling is helping them discover what they're passionate about. They've just been achieving to achieve. They've been achieving without any framework for their achievement. And so, the work is, why are you achieving? Are you achieving because you care about something in the larger world, because you have a larger commitment, because you have an artistic goal? It doesn't, some larger frame, some larger passion that undergirds their achievement. And I want to say two other things finally. One is, I think we have to understand why it is sometimes that we are driving our kids so much. And what does this have to do with really rational reasons? We want our kids to do well in school and achieve. And what does it have to do with irrational reasons? How much is this about our competitive feelings with other parents, about our status concerns? Alyssa Quart, a journalist, says that parents these days are terrified of their kids being ordinary. How much is it a fear of our kids not being special in some way? And I think the good news is that, once you sort out your feelings about these things, you can have great conversations with your kids about this. I have much more authentic conversations with my other two kids about, what power and status and recognition, what these things can bring in your life and what these things really don't bring in your life. And how important passion and gratification and intrinsic gratification is in whatever you do. And let me just say finally, I don't know the answer to this, that I think we are in a grip of a kind of public health problem here. And I say a public health problem both because of the degree of risk that kids are experiencing in affluent communities, the levels of depression, anxiety, substance abuse in affluent communities, but also because it has an epidemic quality, that if your neighbor is getting an SAT tutor for their kid in the 9th grade, you can feel like you're cheating your kid to not get an SAT tutor in the 9th grade. And I've talked to many independent school heads at this point who feel like they're competing with each other, that if the school next door is getting half of its kids into Ivy League schools, they feel like they've got to get half of their kids into Ivy League schools, or they have to have 4 AP courses beginning junior year, or whatever it is, that there's this epidemic quality. And I think this means that individually as parents we have to stand up and have courage, but I also think it means collectively, that we have to think about what to do about this collectively, that there are community things that we have to do about this. So let me stop there, and again, you know what? I'm just going to say one other thing. Sorry, and then I will stop and take your questions and thoughts. And it's related to the conversation I've had with Michael and others about the Children's Museum, and it's related to wanting to build a moral identity in kids and get the focus more off achievement and happiness and more toward morality. And I wanted to say something about the place of religion in American life, because I think one of the things that's happened is that fewer and fewer kids are religiously involved. I didn't grow up in a highly religious family. My kids didn't grow up in a highly religious family. But I am concerned that there are very important things that religious communities do in terms of moral development that we're not reproducing in non-religious and secular communities. And Alain de Botton, a philosopher, has written a great book about this called Religion for Atheists. But in religious communities, there are adults who stand for common values, who are interacting with kids about those values. There are rituals of gratitude. There are blessings. There are rituals where you think and reflect about your obligations to the community, confirmations, bar mitzvahs, bar mitzvahs. There's often a fusion of a moral life and a spiritual life. You think about your obligations to your ancestors and your obligations to your descendants. I mean, these are very important moral functions, and there's a thickness about them that is often hard to reproduce in secular life. So, I'm just encouraging us all to think about how can we reproduce some of these things in non-religious communities. How might we reproduce something as simple as blessings, whether they're religious blessings or not, that families at dinner should do blessings every night, some expression of gratitude every night. We talked about some kind of youth capstone experience in Boston where kids would go through a year of reflection, where they would do projects like interviewing people in their community about what makes a just and caring community, or doing a biography of a kid or a person in their community who's been invisible to them, with adults, and there would be a ceremony of some kind after a public performance of some kind, where they displayed their work and were able to reflect with their community. Thank you.